Greetings, and welcome to Beatles Stuffology, where two old friends sit around and talk BS, Beatles stuff, on a track-by-track basis, pretty much for the sake of it. My name is JG McQuarrie, and I'm here with my co-host, Andrew Deacon. Say hi, Andrew.
Day to you. How are you, JG? Long time no talk.
You got it. It has actually been a little bit of a while since we've had the opportunity to have a conversation, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm struggling onwards. I've had a few little bits and pieces that have kept me off the podcast waves for a few weeks, but it's good to be back and recording again. How are you doing?
I'm okay. I've used my time well to watch and listen to lots of things that get vastly more viewers and listeners than we do, and I've been scratching my head at a couple of them as to work out how do they do that. But there you go.
It'd be
That's
nice.
life. They probably do things like use social media and knowledge.
You want the two things we both go out of our way to avoid.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. In a very traditional sense, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Stay on the right side of truth. Something.
sure.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. We're in one of those sort of weird episode territories where we're not talking about individual songs. We're talking about an album as well, which I think from to peek behind the curtain. The last time I checked as well, they don't tend to get as many as many listeners as the individual song episodes, and I've never worked out why. So if you're not listening to this, but you do listen to our song episodes, please let us know why you're not listening.
That's the kind of logic that people come to expect from this podcast, I think it's fair to say. Actually, I don't know if that's true. I'll maybe do a quick look whilst we're recording and see if that's true, but you might well be right. I don't know. Anyway, yes, we're supposed to be talking about Rubber Soul today, so that's probably what we should talk about. It feels like we've been talking about this album for quite a long time. We probably say that when we get to every album
Yeah.
because we've spent weeks and weeks and weeks taking everyone apart. God knows what it's gonna be like when we get to the White Album. But yeah, it's gonna be interesting. But
Yeah.
anyway, well, yeah. So
I, I
Rubber Soul,
I've just
any
had
good?
I've just had a little thought as to why are the band the 1975 called the 19? I know nothing about them other than the link to Auf Wiedersehen Pet. Why are they called the 1975 and not the 1965? Which just feels like a much more momentous year for the UK pop and rock industry.
Well, I'd also know absolutely nothing about the 1975, so I'm unable to answer that question. But you're not wrong that 1965 is quite the thing.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we are entering into. The '60s in general come with this reputation, as it were, but it certainly feels like we're making much more significant steps away from the Britain that is portrayed in all of those very stoic 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s type films. We're moving away from the representation of the stiff upper lip, aren't we? And I think Rubber Soul reflects that from the name of the album, the image on the front, which is a big step forward in terms of the way in which these albums are presented, but possibly also in fact in terms of the way it sounds.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because, obviously this is the folk album or the stoner album or whatever you want to call it. But I mean, the shift away, I mean, not that Help was not a stoner album, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
It is a very much a shift away from that. And I think when we think of the 60s or when one thinks of the 60s, the idea of, a lot of the certainly the second half of the 60s as being kind of revolutionary, as being very kind of socially and politically charged and full of change. A lot of that originates in 1965, which is handy because it's precisely in the middle of the decade and it makes a really nice, easy reference point. But it is that split. And, particularly, people talk about the way that 1963 was when pop/popular culture changed forever with the arrival of the Beatles. But so much of the social and political changes that we associate with the 1960s, and capital T, capital N, capital S, the big 1960s, happen in 1965. We have Vietnam, we have Castro in Cuba, we have shifting social and political attitudes sort of at home in the United Kingdom, and a lot of what will come to define the decade of the 60s starts here. We haven't quite hit psychedelia, but that's only lurking 6 to 12 months in our future now, and that's kind of the other kind of big missing piece. But socially and politically, kind of like a lot starts here.
Which is quite interesting because all of that is in some way, shape, or form a continuation and perhaps an acceleration of stuff that's come before. So obviously with Vietnam, you've got America picking up what was a French problem before. The psychedelia perhaps builds on elements of the beat movement. Yes, Cuba and Castro, but everybody knows about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was what, 62.
Yep.
And you wonder then if perhaps one of the other big changes was the way in which that old order had been blown apart, part of which could have been things like the Kennedy assassination, where I think people talk about America's loss of innocence. So there's much better podcasts than us will be able to draw some of those ideas together. Although what we should have is that section that says two history graduates sit around and show the world that they didn't really study this period during their.
I stopped in 1945. I don't know about
Well,
you.
that's the problem with British history education, isn't it? That when we were going through it, it did stop around then. However, about 10 to 15 years ago, you started on the A-level history syllabus to get questions about the 80s and Thatcher, which was a little weird when you saw those coming through. And I think that's
Yeah, I think that's true of hires up here now as well.
right.
I think they're covering that kind of period. Yeah, it is odd. And just to be clear to our listeners, like we both studied history at the same university. We're not talking about school level history, but we still
Yeah.
kind of ended at a certain period of time. And it's kind of a shame in a way because it would have been really useful for discussing this episode. But oh well, such is life. But I mean, again, it's like I'm sure we're going to have a lot to talk about when it comes to politics and society moving forward, particularly once we get into 66, 67. But I just kind of want to kind of underline how much of what we tend to think of, or one tends to think of as the politics of the 1960s, really does start here. And we've seen shifting attitudes already when it's come to British politics. Even something as simple as the MBE being awarded to the Beatles is inconceivable. Even like 12 months earlier, it was pretty inconceivable that a bunch of scruffy youths with guitars could be given that kind of award. It was a scandal, but it does show that there were things which were shifting.
If one may counter that thesis with, I don't know if you heard of these facts. Just gonna chuck that out there. It literally wouldn't have happened a year before because when they were awarded, remember, dear listener, there's a difference between when the award is announced and when they received it. They received it in October, but I think the announcement would have come around what would have been called the official birthday honours list, which I think is announced in June. And 12 months before that, there would have been a Conservative government. Wilson's Labour government were elected in the October of 64, and you cannot possibly imagine. Was it Macmillan's government?
Yeah, Macmillan would
No,
never have done anything
exactly.
like that.
That
It's
would not have been a
inconceivable.
Conservative thing to do. Whereas you can imagine that Wilson was attempting to appeal to a slightly different demographic. So you could see yeah, so quite literally wouldn't have happened 12 months before. But then to draw us into the following 12 months, by the following summer, George is telling us to be wary of Mr. Wilson, the Mr. Wilson who effectively gave them this award.
Well, yes, indeed, and we will have plenty more to discuss on Taxman when we kick off Revolver in a few episodes' time.
Overrated.
Sorry.
Nothing. Sorry. No.
Yes. Well, we shall see.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to sort of draw it towards the album, socially and politically, we have a lot sort of going on out with the world. Uh, the extent to which this album reflects that is not high. But it does kind of seem to exist in its own little bubble. There's not an awful lot here that could really be called social or political. You could certainly make a claim for something like the word, and maybe like a stretch in my life, but not an awful lot beyond that, I don't think. So there is still that feeling that there's a little bit of isolation between what the band are doing and what is going on out in the world. How much of that world they get to experience at this stage, given they're still touring, of course, is also a relevant question as well. But there isn't a lot which is yet filtering through. For all the talk of influence of artists like Dylan, certainly that political side has not really made itself felt on Rubber Soul, with, like I said, maybe the exception of the word or something like that.
But then I think it is worth remembering that the zeitgeist, whatever that is at any one time, very, very rarely affects more than just a significant minority. And when the media talks about a mass movement, it's very rare that it is more than the engaged who are involved in it. After all, you know, you couldn't possibly, whilst you could say that a majority of people in the UK in 1965 had heard of the Beatles, you cannot say that the majority of people in the UK in 1965 owned a Beatles record, because then you'd be talking about them selling 25 to 30 million units of an album. And as much as they did sell, they didn't sell 25 million units in the UK in a year or two of an album. So there are always going to be
But you do have to factor single sales into that as well, and those are also up in the millions.
up
So
in the millions.
combined, I don't know.
But you but I mean, but this is the extreme, and even then, if we were talking about most watched television programs, you're maybe talking about estimates of at that point 20 to 30 million as well. So we now might reminisce about the Morecambe and Wise Christmas specials, and they were getting huge audiences, but there were also huge numbers of people who weren't involved. So in some respects, you know, Dylan did sell large numbers of records, not on the Beatles level. He did have number one albums, not at the same extent that the Beatles did in terms of weeks at number one and all of that sort of thing. But his influence, like some other artists, was less on the general population and more then on the people who took up the cudgels after him. So it kind of then sort of fans out from there as well, isn't it? It's like people talked about the Velvet Underground. Is that not that their influence wasn't on record sales because they didn't sell many records, but the people who did buy their records tended to be people who then started their own bands and then had some success. And then as a result, they talked about how important the Velvet Underground were. As a result, more people then went and bought the Velvet Underground records. So they had that influence. The Beatles they are at the forefront of popular culture. But we also need to remember that the other big thing that's at the forefront of popular culture in 1965 is the sound of music.
Yeah, the sound of music is just this unstoppable juggernaut. It's something that we've kind of touched on before. This idea that when you have a band like the Beatles who are recording an album like Rubber Soul, they have a deadline. There is something that they need to hit. They need to get this album out before Christmas, which they do, and it goes to number one. Number two is The Sound of Music. And it feels weird to think of a band like the Beatles having that kind of deadline, as if people aren't going to go out and buy the next Beatles album. But there was still that real fear, definitely from Brian Epstein and just I think generally from the industry, that you don't know when the bubble is going to burst, because there has never been a bubble like this before. It's unprecedented in the development of pop culture. And so the idea that they need to hit a deadline, like they can't spend an extra week just finishing off an album so that they can get rid of a couple of scrappy guitar solos or like tidy up some vocals on it. Nope, you have a deadline just like the rest of the world. And that will eventually shift, but it certainly hasn't at this point. And again, like we know the bubble will never burst. We know people are still going out and buying Beatles albums right this very second, and that will probably always be the case. But back in 1965, that wasn't visible. So the idea they needed to get this out in time was a real factor. And honestly, maybe those people had a point. Like Rubber Soul goes to number one for a few weeks, and then it is immediately deposed by The Sound of Music again. And The Sound of Music holds it off the top spot for 2.5 months. It's not a minor thing. Like Rubber Soul constantly sells less than The Sound of Music does, and that feels astonishing. And it's not the Sound of Music isn't the only soundtrack in the charts at that point. Like when the first week that Rubber Soul is number one, The Sound of Music is number two, and Mary Poppins, the original soundtrack, is number three. So it's not even remotely close to being an outlier. We've brushed up against this before when we've had our album charts, that the number of records which are shifted that are soundtracks is just almost incomprehensibly huge. And like, yeah, The Sound of Music just keeps on trucking.
Sound of Music was not just the biggest selling album of 1965 in the UK, it was the biggest selling album of 1966 as well.
Yeah, it's astonishing, right? I
It
mean,
is.
it's just such an amazing thing. And that first week that Rubber Soul went to number one, yeah, okay, so number two is The Sound of Music, number three is Mary Poppins, number four is Help, number six is Highway 61 Revisited, number seven is Out of Our Heads, and not the greatest Rolling Stones album of all time. And then you've got Andy Williams, you've got The Minstrels, God Help Us All, a
Yeah.
weird Elvis compilation, and Dudley Moore amongst others. It's such a weird list, but I mean the diversity is of types of music, albeit almost exclusively white. But the diversity of music which is there is sort of pretty broad. I mean the Who are in there at number 19 with My Generation, and number 20 is Ken Dodd.
I mean, but then that speaks to the point that pop culture is not universal,
Yeah,
and the
absolutely.
charts reflect a diversity of tastes, and I'm sure there would have been some overlap between those that bought The Sound of Music and those that bought Help and Rubber Soul and then Revolver. But it is remarkable to think that people kept going out and buying The Sound of Music, and in greater numbers than were buying the Beatles album. And so, even in terms of 1966, it spends basically the last about 14 weeks of 1966, and then I think the first few weeks into 1967 at number one, which is just simply incredible. And you think, yes, we now talk about the swinging 60s, but by heck, the end of 1967, Val Doonican has a number one album for 3 weeks. So
Yeah,
it was not, I would say it was not the majority. It was a significant percentage. And as ever with these things, that significant percentage gets overrepresented in some of these historiographical discussions. It's like I'm sure you might have remembered when we were studying history, um, when looking at different approaches, the whole point about, so for example, for example, Marxist approaches was thinking of history from the bottom up, that we get all the stories of the kings and the queens and the battles and so on and so forth. But what we don't get is that sort of social history in terms of what everybody was doing and what everybody was thinking and how normal people lived their lives. That has been addressed in many ways, shape, or forms. But I do think that the Beatles are a behemoth. They are incredible, um, and they represent something that is incredibly important in pop culture in 1965 and the years around it. But even then, we're still not talking about um, we're talking about name recognition rather than being the overwhelming dominant cultural force in the UK, which StatFan seems to suggest is Julie Andrews, and Christopher Plummer and a bunch of kids. But and was it Rodgers and Hammerstein by that stage, or was it still Rodgers and Hart? Anyway, I don't know. Um, but yeah, it's a funny old thing. Your point about the release is an interesting one because, of course, they should have been worried about a drop off, about the bubble bursting, because I'm pretty sure by 1965 the bubble has burst for Jerry and the Pacemakers, for example.
Definitely, yeah, yeah. All of those Mersey beat bands have kind of fallen away. The Manfred Mann are kicking around in the charts. I know they're not a
Yep.
Mersey beat band, but like there's a few kind of like lingering moments. But yeah, like the whole Mersey beat scene has kind of gone. So a lot of those bands that exploded with the Beatles out in 1963, they just don't last.
Yeah.
They fade away. And honestly, most of them kind of deserve to. Most of them aren't really producing. Like a few of them, Jerry and the Pacemakers is a slightly different story, but the vast majority of the Mersey beat bands that follow in the wake of the Beatles aren't very good. They might have a good song or a couple of good songs if they're lucky, but a lot of them is just far too I mean, I don't want to say manufactured, but you know, it's too much of a photocopy of what they are of the original, and they just fade away. But by this point in the charts, I mean, we have got you know, a real sense of something different happening. When we've talked about the charts before, we've kind of talked about the Beatles and then a bunch of soundtrack albums and a bunch of Val Doonigan and Andy Williams and like incredibly sort of bland sort of nothing. But you know, we have the Stones, we have the Kinks, we have the Who, Sonny and Cher in there. You know, so things are shifting. There's definitely Joan Baez is in there, which as well, which is definitely not something we'd have been able to say a year or two ago. So there is that sense, and of course Dylan. So there's that sense that things are definitely moving forward in terms of what's being bought. Yes, the overwhelming majority of music is still falling into the formula that we've just discussed, soundtracks plus, you know, the kind of stuff mums buy essentially. But it is shifting. Like a lot of these other bands are really starting to make their impression on the charts.
We seem to be moving back to a period where big artists are looking to release albums on a more regular basis. So it seems like Taylor Swift is releasing an album any day now. Or it's probably by the time you listen to this, it's probably already out.
Yeah, this is being
And
recorded in October
19
2025. Even.
and I think she had one out last year that she was touring on. Um, and there are a few like that seem to be coming up with albums on a more regular basis, primarily because it then enables them to tour again, which is where all of the big money really
Yeah,
seems to
yeah.
come from. So there seems to be a bit more of a schedule now for recording and releasing, as opposed to perhaps for the 20 years before, where you might be on a 3 year schedule and nobody would bat an eyelid for a major artist if they were on that kind of rotation. But I think actually um, the pressure worked, quite frankly, because who knows, if they had been allowed to spend 18 months recording an album, I suspect an awful lot of these songs wouldn't have um, seen daylight. One or two on Revolver may not have seen daylight. Half a dozen on Sergeant Pepper might not have seen daylight, because they would have come along and gone, well, actually, no, I've written this thing that's a bit better now, so we'll screw that one and we'll have that one instead. And I think the canon would be a lot less interesting for if they didn't have some of these half-formed ideas that have been beat up into pretty decent songs. Um, yeah, I just think we should be grateful that Mr. Epstein was a little bit naive in terms of what was required, and that EMI were putting the pressure on and forcing the 2 album a year structure up to this point, because it means we get something that's a lot of fun. Not necessarily, actually, where I disagree with George Harrison, not necessarily the best Beatles album, um, but a lot of fun and really interesting. And I just think if you'd have gone from Help to Revolver, that would have felt like a bit of a monumental shift. But now it feels like a progression.
Yeah, that's fair. I certainly think that when it comes to Rubber Soul, the songs benefit greatly from having enough time spent on them, but not they're not lingered on. It's not the complexity that we will get with Revolver, but at the same time, it's not the simplicity that we get with Help. And there is a sense that the amount of time, like yeah, like an extra week or two might have been nice to tidy up a few details, but honestly, for the most part, I think these songs kind of sit fine. And of course, at this point in the career, the Beatles are following the kind of album and touring schedule that you just mentioned. You know, they are still out touring albums. They are still filling stadiums, and albums are kind of. I don't want to say they're the things they do in between tours, but also they're the things they're doing in between tours. And again, albums are generating a lot of money, but tours are generating a lot of money, and when that stops in the next year, 1966, we're going to have a whole different approach. But right now, the Beatles are following precisely that pattern that still exists to this day.
One of the sort of pick up on a few points and sort of tie a bit of a thread through it. I think one of the reasons why I slightly rail against the let's describe the 60s. I know you weren't saying this. I know you weren't. But let's describe the 60s in a kind of like a universal way. When we think of the 60s, we think of this. But then my point is, well, let's remember that didn't reflect the lives of the majority of people. Is that gets translated then into some of the retrospective reviews of albums like this as well, which are which some of them are frankly daft, and I wonder as well if George, because George did talk about this being his favourite Beatles album. Um, no, I need to be careful here because I think he described it as his favourite. I don't know if he described it as the best.
Yeah, those two things are not synonyms of each
Yeah,
other.
I mean, he may have described it as the best. I may be misrepresenting here. It may have been his favourite because it may have been the point where he felt that they were the most united, forward-looking, and purposeful as a band, as opposed to certainly in 12 months' time when the recording process gets a lot more disjointed, and then after that you lose Brian Epstein, and after that it gets even more disjointed, and then the arguments come and they start sleeping with each other's wives and all of that sort of thing. They don't, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, Although actually, I
It
was
becomes a whole soap opera.
well. Funnily enough, I was listening to an interview that I nearly called them Bruce and Rick. Then that would have been a Morrissey-esque moment. That David Hepworth and Mark Ellen did on the Word podcast with the author of a new book about Ringo. And did you know this may have been common knowledge, but in the 70s, George was sleeping with Maureen.
Yeah, I knew it because I read an biography of George that was released a year or two ago. It was really bad. It was a terrible book, but it did mention that, and that was the first time I thought, "Oh, I didn't know that." But yeah, yeah, apparently so.
Yeah. Oh, well, what things were like in the 70s, eh? Oh, the 70s.
Yes,
Oh,
well,
punk and prog. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Anyway, let's not do that. But I think the reactions are really, really interesting. So Pitchfork is quite a well-known website and seems to have some level of respect for the views that it gives and the reviews that and I think one of its things is it very rarely gives a 10 out of 10 rating. Well, it gives Rubber Soul a 10 out of 10 rating. Okay, fabulous. It's great that they reflect on the album as fondly as they do. But this is from it. It says by 1965, the Beatles were in danger of seeming lightweight compared to their new peers. Okay, all right. Well, park that for a minute. The
okay.
Who's sloganeering confrontational singles were far more ferocious. The Rolling Stones' I Can't Get No Satisfaction was a much more raucous anti-ennui cry than the Beatles' Help. And the Kinks beat the Beatles to both satirical character songs and the influence of Indian music. By comparison, most of the Beatles' music to date was either rock and roll covers or originals offering a brackets mostly wholesome positive take on boy-girl relationships. Now, before you come in, I've just written under that one short, simple sentence. There's a lot in there that's just plain wrong.
Correct. Firstly, it was the Philip Norman biography of George Harrison that I was talking about, and
Thank
you
you.
would think from somebody like Philip Norman it would be good, but it's not. It's absolutely dreadful. But
Okay.
anyway, that's entirely beside the point. Um, I yeah, most of that's just bollocks, isn't it? I mean,
I know. It's
that
just
sounds like somebody who's writing something less to analyze the subject they're talking about and more to make it sound like they are. I mean, there is certainly, like we talk about the Beatles being at the forefront of popular culture. We talk about them being, crucial in the way that popular music developed and all those things. And that is true. But it obviously doesn't mean that they're the only band that are doing that. Yeah, the Kinks pushed in a particular direction, the Stones pushed in a particular direction, and the Who pushed in a particular direction, as did many, many other bands, of course. The fact that they did that doesn't in any way undermine or change what it is the Beatles are trying to do. And as anybody who owns a device made by Apple will tell you, getting there first is not necessarily the important thing. Getting the best one is the important thing. That's not meant to be a plug for Apple. We're not sponsored, although if they would like to, that obviously that's fine. But the whole point is that Apple's ethos isn't we're going to be the first ones to produce this. It's we're going to iterate it so that it is the best one. Now you can dispute that if you like, but the fact that the Kinks used a bit of Indian music prior to the Beatles doesn't necessarily matter or mean that much. And sort of looping back around to the thing with George saying this is his favorite Beatles album. I mean, we've discussed when we talked about Think for Yourself, for example, that he's made big strides in his songwriting, but something like Norwegian Wood, which is very clearly a John Lennon song and has every hallmark of being a John Lennon song, but his Indian influence is all over it. So his ideas are still feeding into what it is the band is doing. So the fact that the Kinks might have got there a little bit earlier doesn't necessarily make them more significant, because the Beatles aren't being influenced by that. Like the Beatles' journey towards embracing Indian music and philosophy and religion and everything else is exceedingly well documented, and it's not because they heard a single by the Kinks. So yeah, that's spurious at best, I would suggest.
and the thought that they were lightweight, I think is
Yeah.
hilarious.
Yeah. In My Life is a really lightweight song. That's
But
yeah.
describing, well, no, by 96. So this is talking
Oh,
about
okay, so yeah,
so it is talking about how Rubber Soul effectively
all right.
brought them back from this precipice, if you like. But to describe Beatles music to date as either rock and roll covers or originals offering a mostly wholesome positive take on boy girl relationships is just so naive. But something similar could be applied surely to the Rolling Stones, except replace rock and roll with blues.
Yes.
And also, I'm sorry, wholesome, positive take on boy-girl relationships. Come on, come on,
Yeah. I mean,
wholesome.
that's.
Okay, but also
I mean,
in
just looking at Help, you've got to hide your love away. I wouldn't call that a wholesome take on boy girl relationships. Another girl isn't. You're going to lose that girl isn't.
well, if they'd have said offering a mostly slightly misogynistic take on boy-girl relationships, then I might have gone, okay, all right, you've
Well,
got something there.
more defensible, if not
Yeah,
completely accurate either. But
absolutely.
yeah,
So then there's this as well, which is about George. It says, while If I Needed Someone is practically a Birds pastiche, and his chiming sure-footed solo on Nowhere Man also displays a debt to that band. Now, would they really be pastiching a band who'd only just released their first album?
no,
That
they
would
would
that would
not.
display an enormous amount of self-doubt. But I do think there's an argument that says that this is their most Birds adjacent album. It's the one with the most jingle jangle. By the time we move on
Yeah,
to Revolver, that's kind of gone. I think they've shifted up another gear by that point, which is more than you can say for the Birds.
Well, quite. I mean, not just Revolver. Like the next song. Well, I was going to say the next song we're discussing is Paperback Writer. That's not technically true. The next song we'll be discussing is Bad Boy, but that's just
Yeah,
a
that's
little
it's
filler. So
yeah.
we've covered everything. However, yeah, it's not even the next single has already kind of obliterated the jingle jangle. It's something that they did and moved past.
And
But yeah, the idea that they're we're kind of back to, well, what's in the zeitgeist? Like, also, yeah, no, they're not pastiching the birds. That's just bollocks.
and they, and they
I'm not gonna try and talk a way around that.
and they gave it 10 out of 10. And actually, a slight quibble here I've got with another review I'll mention in a moment. How can you give 10 out of 10 to an album that contains What Goes On?
Yeah, or indeed, Run for Your Life.
Well, yeah, okay. Well, see that's actually an interesting point because in um, in 2015, Bob Stanley, look, let's bow at the altar of Bob Stanley, all things Croydon, St Etienne, wrote a good review in the Guardian. But when talking about the weaker tracks, he wrote about Run for Your Life and The Word. There's no mention of What Goes On. I mean,
Yeah.
I disagree with him on both of those grounds. I mean, Run for Your Life, very weak lyrically, but I just think it's really interesting. But I also then um, there are some I mean there are some other weird things. The just as we go back to some of the contemporary reviews and things like the NME and the Record Mirror. Well, NME is reasonably positive, but actually if you look at some of the contemporary reviews, the nature of reviewing in general is very, very different. Whereas, the modern day ones try to have some overarching kind of theoretical, historical um, balance to it, which is admittedly something that we've tried to do as well. This is a case of, and here's the first song is this. It's a jaunty little number in which this happens. Second one's a little bit more downbeat with some fine guitar work from George. And that's the nature of those reviews. But then when you start to get into it a little bit more, you then sort of wonder whether or not they are, as you probably suspect, they're also emphasizing their own particular view on something. So it seems like the NME were a little bit more positive towards the Beatles than certainly from the review that you might think that Record Mirror seemed to be slightly more downbeat on the Beatles, which is very, very odd. They seem to be almost thinking that it is a little bit more backward facing and really not what one's after at the moment. It is quite funny. Yeah, so it's Rubber Soul time, they say, most eagerly awaited. Um, but then we had an early listen, just a formality really, because it's bound to be a massive hit. Let's wander through the tracks one by one, and you just think, whoa, okay. And you've not got a strong piece of writing when one of the subheadings to break up the piece is called is lots of tambourine. Okay, the
Yeah, I got
so
into that in quite some detail, I see.
there you go. So what's the summing up? First one marvels and wonders at the constant stream of melodic ingenuity stemming from the boys, both as performers and composers. Keeping up their pace of creativeness is quite fantastic. Not perhaps their best LP in terms of variety, though instrumentally it's a gas. But then they also effectively preempting another review coming from Richard Green, who's bitterly disappointed with Rubber Soul. Okay, good. So it's not the best in terms of variety. Hmm. Okay.
Interesting take. Yeah,
Yeah.
especially on an album which has something like Michelle on it, or I don't know. People are weird.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose also, I mean, obviously we do speak with the advantage of, 50 plus years of historical perspective. But it is interesting that, the received wisdom that we talk about now isn't something which has always been set in stone. It's not something which has always been exactly what people think. And I do think it is valuable to see how these things shift. I mean, there are plenty of people who will tell you that Rubber Soul is the best Beatles album. I think sometimes a little performatively, if I'm being honest with you. For a long time, it was always Sergeant Pepper. Like, it was the best album ever recorded. It was like Sergeant Pepper and Dark Side of the Moon, and then the rest of recorded music. And that kind of hegemony is long gone now. That's not really, I think, anybody thinks. And so for a long time, it was Revolver is the best album, and then you can't just have one. So yeah, there's a slight performative nature to people who say that Rubber Soul is the best album. If people love it and they genuinely think it's the best album, look, it's not my place to say otherwise. But I would certainly say that there is a subset of people who say that, who are, yeah, yeah, it's a bit performative. And one of the things I always try and do when we have these album discussions is spend some time living with the album, listening to it when I'm driving or when I'm walking to the shops or whatever it is, so that I get a proper sense of it as a piece of work rather than the individual songs that we've discussed. And it is one where I think the whole is more than the sum of the parts. But the idea that it's the best album they've ever recorded, no, no.
No. And it is. I think it's just interesting to see what other people say about it and think about it and the way in which they analyze it. And we can be a bit kind of pompous about this because we get low hundreds as things. So the chances of us ever making any money out of this as a venture are fairly remote. Fairly remote. Except let's remove the words fairly and remote, and just non-existent would be better, wouldn't it? And yet there are people that do. I mean, obviously you've got these reviewers who then are asked to write reviews based upon whatever anniversary is coming up or reissue or what have you. But then you also get people who've built careers, presumably out of not being able to, foster their own career in music. So they then spend a career talking about it, and YouTube is amazing for this. There are quite a lot of people who have done very, very well producing um, regular YouTube videos where they discuss all things music, and they're fantastic for having those thumbnails and titles that might suggest the best thing ever, the worst thing ever. I heard this for the first time and I was shocked. And of course, then you've got to find out if that shocked means they were shocked because it was great, or they were shocked because it was bad, or something in between. And the answer is usually something in between. They weren't really shocked, but clickbait. Huh. But I'm intrigued by one guy called Rick Beato who seems to know what he's talking about, and he gets some good people appearing on his YouTube channel. There are some interesting interviews on there with a couple of different members of the police from time to time, for example. So and there are others. I think he's had Dave Gilmore on there. He talks to some good people. Although he's in a bit of a dispute, I think with Universal at the moment because they feel that by him playing clips of music and him, as in the original recordings, and then analysing them, that he's infringing copyright, and so they're putting in copyright claims against him. But for Michel, he and I was interested in finding out a little bit more about it, especially as we did have a correspondent who talked about how his view of it was much greater than ours. Not that we thought that it's a pile of poo, but perhaps we just didn't think it was as great as he did. And I think the clickbait title on Rick Beato's live stream on this one was that it was the Beatles' most complicated song. Okay, fair enough. Maybe it isn't. It's a YouTube title. Nobody expects it to. And I started watching it, and I just thought, you're telling me nothing. I don't really understand what you're actually saying. And I don't think it's just because I'm not into, um, I'm not a musician. I think it's just generally because it was palpable nonsense. And I've got, some backup to this in a sec. So, for example, I asked one form of AI just to produce me a little transcript which I'll just read. So it starts on F minor, but really C is in the bass here, and then McCartney goes up to F after. It's like starts on F minor to C augmented, and then this is really F minor seventh, F minor six, then D minor, D flat major seven, B flat minor that goes to C5 chord, actually power chord that McCartney is playing on guitar. I assume McCartney is playing guitar on this. Okay, so this is opening. This opening is in F minor, right? So let's just talk about that to begin. This, if you ever wonder, like, well, how do you actually write out the those chord progression, this chord progression? That is, and we call it a line cliche because it has a chromatic, because it moves down chromatically. It goes F minor and then really C augmented. Augmented is with a plus F minus. I mean, it goes on like this for ages. Okay, I mean, this is really strange. I think it's like one of the
Make it
strangest
stop. Make
Beatles.
it
I
stop.
think it's like one of the strangest Beatles. Now that had over 850,000 views, but it's not music theory. He sells courses on music theory, so you think he knows what it's not telling me how that makes it complicated. It's not telling me how that makes it a great song. It's saying it plays
Yeah.
this chord and then he plays this chord and then he plays this chord and then he plays. I mean, that's literally what it is. There's no actual insight there. I think that may be one of the greatest tricks the devil ever pulled. Now, I don't think that of those 850,000 plus people watching it, many of them will have got that from it. They would have just sort of sat there going, "Oh, here's a nice bloke saying nice things about a song I like," and I know that because I went through quite a lot of the YouTube comments, and the YouTube comments are pretty much universally, "Oh yeah, I think this is a really great song. Oh yeah, my mum's called Michelle because of this song," and it's those sorts of things. They're people who've got an emotional response to the song, not people who are engaging in a music theory type discussion. But it blows my mind that gets as many views as it does. I mean, he's clearly very, very successful. And I've clearly just ended up picking on one video that is just bobbins, because he's had, for a video released in the last week, he's had over 2 million views about on his opinion on the new drummer for Rush. So there's an audience out there for this kind of thing that we're not tapping into.
No, well, to be fair, and I hope you won't take this as an insult because it's not meant that way. He is also a very handsome man. Not that I'm saying that that in any way influences why people might watch a YouTube video, but you know, there is that too. We are hidden behind the anonymity of not having any video whatsoever, so we are safe from criticism or judgment on that front. But yeah, I mean, the whole thing about that you just read out there. Firstly, it's just so staggeringly dull. But it's like a nitpicker's guide to music. It's like it's not criticism, either small or capital C, and it's not theory. It's just this is what it is. Say, okay, you probably could have just got the same information from looking at the sheet music. Okay, the sheet music isn't being narrated by a handsome man, but other than that, you're not really getting an awful lot for it from your description. I haven't seen the video, but that's kind of, I mean, it's kind of, you know, not seeing the wood for the trees. It's a weird way of looking at it. But like you said, there is obviously a market for it. Like if he's getting almost 1 million
Yeah,
views for that kind of stuff, it clearly exists. And you know, we're not. So
yeah, and
you know, who's
good luck
the
to
real
him.
winner here? Us. We know better.
But oh, yeah. However, here's a review. Now, I think this is a retrospective review of contemporary feelings about Rubber Soul, and this is taken from a Times Online article. I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a bit. I'll just pick a couple of bits out. So it must have been in November of '65. I was living in this house in the Hollywood Hills then, way up on Laurel Way, and I remember sitting in the living room one night talking with some friends when a friend came in with a copy of the Beatles' new one, Rubber Soul. I don't know if it had even come out yet, but he had it, and so we put it on the record player, and wow, as soon as I started hearing it, I loved it. I mean, I caps loved it. I still remember hearing Michelle for the first time, and Girl. What an incredible song. Everything about the way John Lennon sang and the lyrics he was writing. Oh, girl, girl, it sounded amazing. Yeah, this describes "You Won't See Me" as a cheerful pop song. "Think for Yourself" is kind of dark. I'd forgotten that was George's song. Oh well, I know it has that cool fuzzy bass sound. So we're getting that emotional response. And then for "In My Life," this says, "And that's my favourite song on the record too, except for Norwegian Wood. I love the sound of John's voice. I'd never heard a collection of songs that were all that good before. It's like a collection of folk songs, and they're all just really, really great songs. Not just about love, they're about different things, but they all go together somehow." Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Wilson.
There you go.
The only bit that kind of spoils it for some people, I think, at the end, where he says that it's still my favourite Beatles album, that and Let It Be. Now, I really like Let It Be. I really do like Let It Be, but I wouldn't put it as with the favourite. But then I'm not Brian Wilson. And I think that's another point then in terms of, well, like the Velvet Underground, you could talk about the people that the Beatles influenced. And we know there's that, the story about the influence that this had on Pet Sounds. Although he says it didn't clarify my ideas for Pet Sounds exactly, but it inspired me. Now I'm going to make an album just as good as Rubber Soul. There you go. And if that inspired him, then that's fantastic. And he reckons that the next morning he went to the piano and wrote "God Only Knows" with Tony Asher. Now, Brian Wilson's memory may not be the most perfect thing.
Possible.
However, if those two are in any way connected, then Rubber Soul's pretty damn important.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard to argue with that, or indeed with anything that helped to produce God Only Knows, given that it's one of the best songs ever
Yeah,
written. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, sort of pulling it down from the sort of critical theory and sort of analysis side of things to your perspective. We might have touched on this before, but how did you come to Rubber Soul? Was it one that you just randomly grabbed, or was it one that you kind of think, oh, all right, no, I actually want to go out and get this?
I think I was filling in the gaps. And I think I would have bought it on one of those old cassettes that was probably released at some point in the 70s, maybe early 80s, but I would have bought late 80s, with the kind of the slightly yellowy surround with the
Mm.
small version of um, the actual album cover in the middle. I would either have bought it Beano's in Croydon as second hand, or I might have been asking for it as a Christmas present to fill in the gaps. I don't know, but it would have been something like that, and it probably would have been about 87, 88, maybe 89. And I don't know how many of the songs on there I would have heard before. I would have been aware of a couple of the titles, but there's probably not a lot on there that I would have actually gone, oh yeah, I have heard this before. Maybe if something had been used on a TV program, but we know that with the Beatles at that point, that was kind of quite rare. That would get done as well. So yeah, reasonably late, and I think it would have been one of the ones that would have come after things like the White Album and Revolver and Sergeant Pepper and buying those. Um, yeah, and I think I wonder if because I wouldn't have known the songs on there is primarily because of course they weren't putting singles on as well. So you might have heard the single at some point on a compilation or on a on the radio, for example. But at that point, people weren't really playing the Beatles as much.
No, you didn't get a lot around at that time. Certainly not a lot on radio. You certainly wouldn't have got anything on Radio 1. You might have got a few stray tracks on Radio 2, but it was not. I mean, it was not
Yeah,
a thing to be into during that period of time. The Beatles, they were the rock dinosaurs. They were the ones that were being pushed out of the way for everything else that was going on in the 80s. So yeah, no, there wouldn't have been a lot around. I don't
yeah.
think at that point.
What I don't remember is exactly how I felt about it. I mean, I knew it was better than Beatles for Sale, Um, but I think
I mean,
it
hard to argue that point.
I suspect I probably would have thought that it was good, but a bit lightweight in places. Because I don't think that's necessarily unfair
I
if
was
you're
going to say,
listening
is
to
that
it
still your
out of
opinion?
order. No, no, not at all. But I was listening to it, would have been listening to it out of order. So I probably would have heard it after Revolver. And if you get smacked in the face by Tomorrow Never Knows, for example, then everything's gonna feel a little bit lightweight by comparison. But then that's just that emotional response at the time. I don't then think it's one that I would have listened to a lot because again, it doesn't have. Oh well, I mean, yes, it does. It's got In My Life and a couple of other really, really top-notch stuff. But then, if you start then saying, well, okay, Sergeant Pepper's got, a day in the life and she's leaving home, for example, fairly close together, within a few, even if it's within 10 minutes of each other, you've got something that's pretty epic. And you've got such variety on that album and such kind of power and even recently, sort of for reasons we don't need to go into, the opening track has been ploughing through my mind a lot, and the whole 20 years ago today bit, and the power of that and the ingenuity of that, and then chuck in the reprise as well with the amazing guitar line that stings through that. And there's so much power in that album. There's so much invention in that album that it's going to make this feel quite slow. And I love Revolver and I love some songs that perhaps others don't. I really like Angel Birkensing and Dr. Robert, for example. Um, and I don't and again with those and the way in which they're played and recorded, this is going to sound a little bit lightweight in comparison, but that's okay because it's still pretty darn good.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I definitely would have come to this after Sergeant Pepper, after Magical Mystery, and after the White Album. And yeah, without any sense of really the order that things were released in, the order things should be listened in, the idea of that kind of progress, like particularly when I was first listening to a lot of this kind of stuff as a teenager, those aren't kind of questions that would have occurred to me. They are. It's that I didn't even know what I didn't know kind of thing. Like I didn't know really anything. It's like, okay, this cassette has the word The Beatles on the front of it. I'll buy it because that's a thing I like. Like that was as far as things like you couldn't just even. I don't think I even had any like reference books or anything at that point where you could pick them up and go, "All right, well, it starts with Please Please Me and it finishes with Let It Be," and in between there's all the like that wasn't a thing. And even if it was, it would have been randomly down to whether I could afford something or whether I looked at the back track listing and went, "Oh, I quite like that one. Okay, right, well, I'll grab this then." So yeah, I kind of probably would have been in a similar situation. I think I said earlier that I think that Rubber Soul is more than the sum of its parts, and I think that is true. I don't think that's true for every album that we've covered so far. I don't want to go back to Beatles for Sale again, but oh well, there it is. So I kind of wish I liked it slightly more than I do. I do really like Rubber Soul. I do think it's a really good album. And I've really, really enjoyed listening to it as an album, not as a series of individual songs. I do think from that like Brian Wilson quote, like everything fits together is correct. And I think it is with maybe the exception of A Hard Day's Night, I think it's the best example that we have had of that so far, where everything feels like it is a cohesive single whole. That's in and of itself is quite a big step forward. When we were talking about Help, we did mention, okay, we think that there's a relatively clear dividing line between the stuff that was written for the movie and the stuff which is the other songs on the album. It's not quite as clear cut as that, but broadly speaking, you can kind of see where the join is, and that's fine. There isn't a join in Rubber Soul in the same way, and it's not as scattershot as something like, say, Beatles for Sale or Please Please Me or whatever, where we need 12 or whatever songs for an album. Here they are. This has been constructive. We talked about sequencing before, so I'm not going to sort of drag over all that again. But there is a sense that there is a real cohesion to this album that we haven't seen before. Not that we haven't seen any, but we haven't seen it done as well as this. We haven't seen it functioning as well as this. And the flow from Drive My Car through to Run for Your Life really is a flow. Everything does run very well. And not all songs are equal. Of course they're not. That would be ridiculous, especially when What Goes On is sticking out there. But it's a very well constructed, well put together album that stands the test of time. It's not my favorite Beatles album because I'm not going to be performative like that, but it is still an astonishing achievement. It really is. And I don't want to sound like I'm underselling it because I'm not, but I really, really do like it.
I think one aspect to consider is that perhaps there isn't um, some of the very deliberate, if you like, performative variety that has been on. I'll give you a specific example in a moment. That has been on albums up till now, and will reappear, but in a much more sophisticated fashion on, for example, Sergeant Pepper with When I'm 64. What we've not got on here is the McCartney song for the parents, or for the older folk. The closest we've got to that, I think, is Michelle, but that's a bit of a jokey, misses the mark, but a bit of a jokey kind of satirical, jaunty little thing. It's not really in, the Besame mucho styly, as it were, that does kind of infect some of the earlier albums. There's no obli-dee, obli-da on here. There's no Maxwell Silver Hammer. So there isn't, so it does feel a little bit more contained and perhaps with the exception of What Goes On, purposeful. Just sort of looking through the listing, and I don't know what goes on. There's nothing there that sticks out as being of significantly lower quality than the rest. It fits together. It works. I do have one sort of follow-up point on the whole Brian Wilson thing. Of course, what we don't know is which version of the album he was listening to.
Well, that's also a significant thing as well, whether it was the British or the American release,
Yeah,
because that does make a difference in terms of the whole "it's a folk album" angle.
exactly. Yeah, because I think was it drop drive my car. What goes on? Nowhere Man, I think, was missing off the American one. But then they did have, I think, I've just seen a face as well. So yeah, I think people have said they perhaps felt a little bit more folksy. Um, yeah. So the interesting, bearing in mind you might talk about that folksy bit or the jingle jangle element as well. Bearing in mind it's Rubber Soul. And I wouldn't have, when I first bought the album all those years ago, I'm not sure I would have even been aware of even though it would have been around at the time, of the plastic soul expression as a sort of a bit of an insult.
Yeah.
Um, so the fact that might have been used as a bit of a play on that and as a bit of self-deprecating humor is in itself quite interesting. So they knew what they were doing, and we are getting to the point, aren't we, where pretty soon the balance in the studio is going to tip much further in favor of the Beatles from George Martin. George Martin is going to be the conduit in order to provide them with the things that they need, as opposed to the person who is kind of setting a little bit more of the tempo for how things are recorded. It's just another way in which this is that important post that marking, that line in the sand, that from without this, perhaps we wouldn't get to that. And you know what? That makes it pretty darn important, as well as being pretty darn good.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I've got an awful lot to add to that. If I'm honest with you, is there anything else you want to sort of talk about around this album? I mean,
Um,
I pretty
I,
much just agree with what you said. I mean, there's not a lot of controversy there. I don't think.
no, and if people want to listen to discussions on the individual tracks, then go back and listen to the previous episode. Actually, as we've managed to put together over an hour of tip top researched brackets, some close brackets, discussion on the album. I mean, I could talk about it for a lot longer, um, but I'd be talking to myself. And let's face it, if people did start listening to this, they probably switched off half an hour ago.
I think if we've managed to get an hour out of this, we've really been doing okay. I could also talk about this album for a lot longer, but I think we've probably hit all the major points that we need to without having to dive in or risk repeating ourselves. So
We do need just to say then, don't we, that Kenneth, if you made it this far, let us know.
yes, I think that's exactly what we need to say. Also, score, please.
Right. Okay. Do you have scores, the previous album scores available?
Yes, I have them in
Because it's
front
going to
of me.
be relational. Obviously, I
Okay,
can't
that's
give it
fine.
10 out of 10 because what goes on? But then I've also got to consider what's coming.
Okay,
Whoa.
would you like me to tell you the scores you've given the album so far?
Well, I'm assuming that Hard Day's Night is the one that I've given the highest score to so far.
That is correct. That
Was
was a
that an eight?
seven.
I was
No,
seven.
seven. Yeah,
Okay, then I'm quite happy to go with an eight.
an eight.
Eight for this. And I suspect if back in 1988, it probably would have been a six.
Okay, well,
But
that's interesting.
what did I know then?
Well, yes. Okay, good.
Oh, you
I
wanted an
fought
answer to
myself and
that.
say, well, what do you know now? But I didn't say it, so that's fine. I'm off the hook. What am I going to give for my soul? So Hard Day's Night is also my highest score to date, which is 7.5. So I suppose if I was being relative, I would give it 8.5. But I think I'm going to go along with you. I think I'm going to give it an 8. I think that's probably fair. That gives plenty of headway. My favorite album is still to come. So yeah, I think that'll be fine. Yeah, an 8. I'm comfortable with that. Excellent. Good, lovely. Well, there we go. I think we can probably leave things there for time being. Thank you for everyone who's made it through this rambling series of observations for an hour. It's very much appreciated, and we are very grateful for your time. Yeah, that'll do us for now. You can really get a hold of us. You can contact us by email. We are BeatlesStuffology@gmail.com. We are on the smouldering remains of Twitter at Beatles_ology, and we are Beatles Stuffology on Instagram. You can also find my blog at www.jgmcquarrie.scot. Please like, rate, and review us on whatever podcatcher you're using so that more people can find the show. Now, normally at this stage, I say next episode we have, but actually it's not. It's next Minnesota, because we're going to cover Bad Boy next, and we probably don't need a full episode to cover that. So it will be the second of our minisodes. But anyway, we'll be talking about Bad Boy. And as always, we hope you're going to join it for us. But until then, keep listening.